Balak is still trying to get Balaam to curse Israel, but he's 0 for 2. He thinks the third time might be the charm, so he's taken Balaam to a third peak, this time Mount Peor. Again, Balak built 7 altars and offered a bull and a ram on each, and that's where we left off. This is the third and final chapter about Balak and Balaam, Numbers chapter 24, verse 1. When Balaam saw that it pleased Yahweh to bless Israel, he didn't go as at other times to meet with enchantments, but he set his face toward the wilderness. Balaam lifted up his eyes, and he saw Israel dwelling according to their tribes, and the Spirit of God came on him. Comment, he's about to speak under God's inspiration. Verse 3, he took up his parable and said, Balaam the son of Beor says, the man whose eyes are open says, he says who hears the words of God, who sees the vision of the Almighty falling down and having his eyes open. How goodly are your tents, Jacob, and your tents, Israel. As valleys they are spread out, as gardens by the riverside, as aloes which Yahweh has planted, as cedar trees beside the waters. Water shall flow from his buckets, his seed shall be in many waters. His king shall be higher than Agag, his kingdom shall be exalted. God brings him out of Egypt. He has, as it were, the strength of the wild ox. He shall eat up the nations, his adversaries, shall break their bones in pieces, and pierce them with his arrows. He couched down, he lay down as a lion, as a lioness. Who shall rouse him up? Everyone who blesses you is blessed. Everyone who curses you is cursed. Comment, verse 4, Balaam sees a vision of himself falling down before the Almighty, with his eyes wide open so he can still see, and he also hears the words of God. Verse 6, he saw Israel as a garden by the riverside. Water such a blessing in the desert that the river indicates Israel's blessed. This is why Balaam sees luxurious plants like aloes and magnificent cedars growing in the garden. It's a sign that Israel's blessed. Verse 7 speaks of Israel's seed. Seed is singular. It's Hebrew wazaro. It's singular, one seed. A seed is a descendant. So one seed indicates one descendant in particular. That's the seed Yahweh's been talking about ever since he spoke of it to Eve, Genesis 3:15, then to Abraham, Genesis 22:18, to Isaac, Genesis 26:4, and to Jacob, Genesis 28:14. That one seed is the coming descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Jesus of Nazareth, the Messiah. See Galatians 3:6 for confirmation of that interpretation. In the King James Version, quote, now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. He saith not, and seeds as of many, but as of one, and to thy seed, which is Christ, end quote. That was Paul. Luke gives the same interpretation, Acts 3, verses 25 and 26. So there's absolutely no doubt the seed, singular, also translated offspring or descendant, is Christ. Still in verse 7, the seed shall be in many waters. The Christ or Messiah will bless all the nations of the earth. Many sons and daughters will arise from that seed, Hebrews 2:13. Jesus didn't marry or have children, so his offspring are spiritual. They're his believers. Still in verse 7, and still talking about the Messiah, Israel's king shall be higher than Agag. Agag will be a future king of the Amalekites, or this could refer to some other Agag of high status that was already arisen by that time. But higher than Agag means the coming Messiah of Israel will have great status. Still in verse 7, his kingdom shall be exalted. Of course, the Messiah will be King of Kings, and his kingdom will be so exalted that it cannot be adequately expressed. His kingdom defies description and comparison for glory. Then in verse 9, God refreshed that famous promise to Israel, quote, everyone who blesses you is blessed. Everyone who curses you is cursed, end quote. Putting all that together, if we know what's good for us, we should bless Israel, not curse Israel. Balak didn't like any of that one bit as we go to verse 10. Balak's anger burned against Balaam, and he struck his hands together. Balak said to Balaam, I called you to curse my enemies, and behold, you have altogether blessed them these 3 times. Therefore flee to your place now. I thought to promote you to great honor, but behold, Yahweh has kept you back from honor." Balaam said to Balak, "Didn't I also tell your messengers whom you sent to me, saying, if Balak would give me his house full of silver and gold, I can't go beyond Yahweh's word, to do either good or bad from my own mind. I will say what Yahweh says. Now behold, I go to my people. Come, I will inform you what this people shall do to your people in the latter days." Comment, Balaam says, "I'm not going anywhere yet. I'm not done. I'm going to tell you what Israel will do to your people Moab in the latter days." Verse 15. He took up his parable and said, Balaam the son of Beor says, the man whose eyes are open says, he says, who hears the words of God, knows the knowledge of the Most High, and who sees the vision of the Almighty, falling down and having his eyes open, I see him, but not now. I see him, but not near. A star will come out of Jacob. A scepter will rise out of Israel, and shall strike through the corners of Moab, and break down all the sons of Sheth. Comment, verse 17, Balaam is seeing the Messiah, but he's not near, meaning it's going to be a while before he comes. Also in verse 17, the star that comes from Jacob is the Messiah. Back in the day, Yahweh told Abraham one starry night, quote, "Look now toward the sky and count the stars, if you are able to count them. So will your offspring be." Genesis 15:15. The number of stars was the number of Abraham's future offspring, but out of that number, one in particular will be the Messiah. In Balaam's time, that star had not yet appeared, so he said in verse 17, a star will come out of Jacob. Still in verse 17, this one will have a scepter, meaning he'll be a king. He'll, quote, break down all the sons of Sheth, end quote. Sheth means tumult. The star of Jacob will break down the sons of tumult. In other words, he'll destroy everyone who creates havoc, Revelation 19:15. This will establish peace, and the peace will last 1,000 years, Revelation 23. After the end of that, there's going to be a brief rebellion, Revelation 20, verse 9, followed by peace for eternity after that. Yahweh had it all planned going way back. Balaam still speaking under inspiration as we go to verse 18. Edom shall be a possession. Seir, his enemies, also shall be a possession, while Israel does valiantly. Comment, Edom is south of Moab. Mount Seir is Edom's famous mountain. So when it says Edom and Seir shall be a possession, it indicates for one thing that King David of Israel will subdue Edom, which came to pass around 1040 BC. All Edom became David's servants, 2 Samuel 8:14. And of course, in further fulfillment of possession, Israel's Messiah will eventually exercise his possession over every nation, ruling with a rod of iron, Revelation 12:5. There's been Pax Romana and Pax Americana during history, but nothing will compare to Pax Christiana, the peace imposed by Christ. Moving on, verse 19, out of Jacob shall one have dominion, and shall destroy the remnant from the city. Comment, remnant from the city is literally remnant from Ar, A-R, in Hebrew. Now Balaam's really disappointing Balak. Ar is one of his cities on the Arnon River, which at that time was the border between Israel and Moab, Numbers 21:15. How did Moab become only a remnant of what they were during Balak's time? Later in history, King David will kill 2/3 of the Moabites and subjugate the rest, 2 Samuel 8:2. David is certainly one out of Jacob who will have dominion over Moab, but he didn't destroy every remnant of Moab. After that, Nebuchadnezzar II of Babylon destroyed Moab much more thoroughly. Ezekiel also predicted this, chapter 25, verses 10 and 11, and it came to pass in 586 BC. At that time also the words of Jeremiah came to pass, quote, Moab will be destroyed from being a people because he has magnified himself against Yahweh, Jeremiah 48:42. That was the extent of the destruction mentioned by Balaam in verse 19. But Balaam says in verse 19, someone out of Jacob will bring the destruction of any remnant. This might refer to the end of the millennium when Christ will destroy the earth and every remnant of mankind who opposes him, including Moab, of course, Revelation 20, verse 9 and 20:11. Now coming up, Balaam addresses the eventual fate of other nations surrounding Canaan, verse 20. He looked at Amalek and took up his parable and said, Amalek was the first of the nations, but his latter end shall come to destruction. He looked at the Kenite and took up his parable and said, Your dwelling place is strong, your nest is set in the rock. Nevertheless, Cain shall be wasted until Asher carries you away captive. He took up his parable and said, Alas, who shall live when God does this? But ships shall come from the coast of Kittim. They shall afflict Asher and shall afflict Eber. He also shall come to destruction. Comment, that was a 360-degree tour around Israel. Amalek and the Kenites were desert dwellers to the south and east. Asher is Assyria, which is east and north. Kittim was on the island of Cyprus to the west of Israel, so that's east, west, north, and south. Balaam predicted destruction for all of them. With regard to specific fulfillment, which is now part of recorded history, verse 22, Balaam said Asher would carry away the Kenites captive. This was fulfilled in the 9th century BC. Asher was the chief city of the Assyrian Empire, and Assyria did indeed subjugate the Arab tribes to their south, including, one would suppose, the Kenites, about 400 years after Balaam pronounced it. Going on, verse 25, Balaam rose up and went and returned to his place, and Balak also went his way. Comment, thus ends the story of Balak and Balaam, defeat for them both. The bottom line is that one out of Jacob, the Messiah, will bring all kingdoms into subjection. Balaam's intention was to curse, and we'll soon see that God will repay him for that intention. That's the chapter. See you for Numbers 25 at landofhavilah.net, Numbers 25.